The courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, a scent that clung to the walls like the tension in the air. Sunlight streaked through the tall windows, catching dust motes as if the room itself were holding its breath. Every eye in the packed courtroom was fixed on the woman seated at the defendant's table. She was small, almost fragile, her hands folded neatly in her lap, fingers entwined as though clinging to some invisible lifeline. Her name was Clara Jensen, and to everyone watching, she seemed utterly quiet. Not a murmur escaped her lips, not a flicker betrayed her thoughts. The prosecution had painted her as cold, indifferent, a mother who had failed her child in the gravest way imaginable. But Clara's silence wasn't a sign of guilt, it was a shield. A shield for the one person who mattered more than anything, her 8-year-old daughter, Sophie. Sophie sat in the courtroom gallery, her small frame almost swallowed by the wooden bench. Her eyes, wide and luminous, were glued to her mother. She didn't fully understand the legal jargon, the accusations, or the heavy words that filled the air, but she felt the weight of the room pressing down on her like a storm. Her tiny hands clutched a worn stuffed rabbit, her last connection to comfort in a world that had suddenly turned frightening. Judge Harold Benson cleared his throat, his voice steady and authoritative. "This court will come to order. The People versus Clara Jensen will proceed." His gavel struck the wooden block with a sharp crack that echoed through the high-ceilinged room. Silence fell like a blanket. The prosecutor, a tall, sharp-eyed man named William Harrington, rose. He had the kind of voice that could slice through tension like a knife. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, pacing slowly before the jury, "we are here today because a mother, entrusted with the care of her child, has," he paused, letting the words sink in, "allegedly abandoned that duty in the most serious of ways." The jury leaned forward, some pens poised to take notes, others simply holding their breath. Every word felt heavier than the last. Clara didn't flinch. Not once. Her silence was almost defiant. But inside, her heart hammered. Every word spoken against her carved a tiny wound she hid behind her composed exterior. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, but she knew that opening her mouth too soon could shatter the delicate plan she had spent years crafting to protect Sophie. Her lawyer, Eleanor Martinez, a sharp, determined woman with streaks of gray in her hair, gave Clara a reassuring nod. Eleanor had spent months preparing for this moment, combing through evidence, uncovering witnesses, and strategizing. She knew the truth. And more importantly, she knew that Clara's silence wasn't weakness, it was strength. The prosecutor continued, his tone calculated, almost theatrical. On the night of July 12th, Ms. Jensen allegedly left her daughter alone in their apartment for over 12 hours. During that time, the child was exposed to dangerous conditions, potentially life-threatening circumstances. We will show that this was not an accident, but a series of deliberate choices that put an innocent child at risk. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Sophie's grip on her stuffed rabbit tightened, and for a moment, her small body shook with fear. She looked at her mother, whose gaze remained calm, steady, though inside, Clara felt as though the ground beneath her was cracking. Clara's mind flashed back to that night, the night that had changed everything. She remembered rushing home after her late shift at the hospital, only to find that the apartment door was ajar. The panic, the sheer terror as she realized Sophie was missing, and then the desperate chase across the city to protect her child from a danger no one else could see. She had made choices that no one could understand, choices that kept Sophie safe but made Clara a target for the law. The jury didn't know the full story. The judge didn't know. The public certainly didn't. Only Clara knew the truth, and revealing it too soon could destroy the fragile threads holding Sophie's safety together. Eleanor stood and addressed the jury next, her voice calm but firm. "Members of the jury," she said, "the events of that night are not as they appear. Ms. Jensen's actions were not of neglect, but of protection. She remained silent for months, not out of apathy, but because she was safeguarding her daughter from dangers most of us cannot even imagine. The room shifted slightly, a subtle tension. The jurors exchanged glances, some skeptical, others curious. Eleanor's words had planted the first seed of doubt, a seed Clara had prayed would grow into understanding. Clara's eyes drifted towards Sophie again. She saw her daughter's wide, trusting gaze and felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. She wanted to reach out, to reassure Sophie that everything would be okay, but she stayed still. She could not falter, not now. Every heartbeat, every silent breath, was a promise to her child. I will protect you, no matter the cost. The bailiff called the first witness, and the courtroom fell into a tense rhythm of questioning and quiet observation. Each word, each pause, each glance carried weight. Clara remained silent, her face a mask of composure, but beneath it, a storm of emotion churned, a storm fueled by love, fear, and the unshakable desire for justice. And as the courtroom clock ticked forward, marking the minutes of this trial that could decide their lives, Clara Jensen's silent resolve became the most powerful voice in the room. The story of the silent mother was just beginning. The courtroom receded in Clara's mind like a distant echo. Her eyes, though fixed on the proceedings, were seeing the nights she had spent pacing the apartment, wondering how she could protect Sophie without anyone understanding the danger. The trial had stripped her of normalcy, of freedom, and yet, the story the world would hear was only half the truth. It had all begun when Sophie was 4, an age when a child's laughter fills every corner of a home. Clara had worked long hours at the city hospital, often returning home exhausted, but she never allowed that exhaustion to touch her daughter's world. Sophie's giggles became Clara's anchor, her reason to endure the chaos that life often tossed her way. One evening, as they were walking home from the small playground near their apartment, a shadow followed them, subtle, almost imperceptible, but Clara's instinct screamed danger. She had noticed it before, a man who lingered outside their building, asking questions, sometimes pretending to tie his shoelaces near the staircase, always watching. Clara had reported it to the police, but without proof, nothing could be done. That night, she lay awake, Sophie sleeping beside her, soft breaths against her cheek. Clara realized that the world would not protect her child the way she could. If danger lurked, it was on her shoulders alone to shield Sophie, no matter how extreme the measures. And so she began planning, quietly and meticulously, to keep her daughter safe from harm no one else could see. The most harrowing memory came from a night 2 years ago. The threat Clara had sensed, one that she could never speak of publicly, had finally taken action. A stranger had attempted to force his way into their apartment. Clara had managed to subdue him, but in the chaos, Sophie had fled into the streets, terrified and screaming. Panic clawed at Clara's chest as she chased her daughter through the darkened streets of the city. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, she had cornered Sophie near the park, clutching her small body tightly, whispering promises she hoped would hold through the nightmare. "I'll always protect you, no matter what." That night, Clara had made a choice. Sometimes, to save her child, the world must never know the truth. It was that choice that had led to the trial. On the night of July 12th, the night the prosecution called her negligent, Clara had been faced with a similar danger. Sophie had come home from school complaining of a stomach ache, but something in her small body, the way she shivered, the way her eyes darted nervously, told Clara that something was wrong. She suspected the danger was near again. But Clara had a shift at the hospital. Emergency cases couldn't wait. Every patient who came through those doors was a life in her hands. She knew she couldn't leave, not without arranging protection. So she devised a plan, one she knew few would understand. She left Sophie with trusted neighbors, carefully instructing them, but she did not tell the authorities. She couldn't. The danger was of a kind the world would not comprehend, a danger that involved people in positions of trust, authority figures who would laugh if she even hinted at it. So she stayed silent, watching from a distance, ensuring her daughter's safety without exposing her secret. But someone had noticed. A neighbor, misunderstanding her instructions, reported that Sophie had been left alone. By the time Clara returned, the authorities had arrived. The child was safe, unharmed, but Clara's life was about to unravel. The flashbacks continued, weaving a tapestry of sacrifice. Clara had worked multiple jobs, skipped meals, missed sleep, and carried the weight of the city's dangers alone, all for Sophie. She remembered standing in the hospital cafeteria, eyes rimmed red, holding a cup of coffee she didn't have time to drink, reading a note Sophie had written, "Mommy, you're my hero." That note had been tucked into Clara's coat pocket on the night she was arrested, a silent testament to why she had endured everything. Her mind drifted further back to the very first day of school, Sophie clutching her hand tightly, trembling at the threshold of a world Clara could not fully shield her from. And yet, that small grip, that trusting glance, had filled Clara with a courage she had never known existed. If the world was harsh, she would be harsher for her child. If the world was unjust, she would bend it with her own hands to protect Sophie. The trial itself had peeled open these memories in painful ways. Each witness for the prosecution, each carefully curated photograph or report, was another knife twisting into her reputation. The media had already painted her as an uncaring mother. But Clara held the truth close, a jewel of love and sacrifice hidden in plain sight. And through it all, Sophie remained her beacon. In the courtroom, the little girl sat quietly, clutching her rabbit, watching her mother. Clara's gaze lingered on Sophie more than anything else. Every argument, every accusation, every smirk from the prosecution was nothing compared to the child's safety. She would endure humiliation, slander, and suspicion, but Sophie would never bear the burden of her mistakes. Eleanor Martinez, her lawyer, had been Clara's silent ally, seeing what no one else could. Eleanor had spent countless nights with Clara, piecing together the timeline, gathering proof, understanding the subtle nuances of the events that had led to that fateful night. Clara, Eleanor had whispered during one particularly exhausting session, "The world isn't ready to understand your choices. But we will make them see. And when they do, justice will follow." The flashbacks shifted back to the night that had started the trial. Clara had returned to her apartment after the hospital shift to find Sophie sleeping peacefully, unaware of the chaos unfolding outside. But by morning, the police had arrived, the neighbors' calls had been made, and Clara had been handcuffed. She had watched Sophie from a distance, hidden behind the door of a friend's apartment, the child unaware of the storm gathering around her mother. It was then that Clara realized the cruelest irony of all. The very actions that had saved Sophie's life had placed Clara in the position of being judged as a criminal. As the flashbacks ended, Clara returned to the courtroom, her eyes dry, her composure intact. But inside, the emotions churned violently. She knew the next steps of the trial would demand everything she had: patience, endurance, and the courage to keep the truth safe until the moment it could be revealed without endangering her daughter. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and exhaustion, a small flame of hope flickered. Eleanor had a plan. Evidence was waiting. The truth, once revealed, would vindicate Clara, not only in the eyes of the law but in the eyes of the world. But until that moment, Clara Jensen remained silent, a mother willing to endure suspicion, ridicule, and fear for the one thing that mattered more than anything: Sophie's life. The courtroom had become a theater of tension. Every glance, every cough, every shuffle of papers carried weight. The city's sun poured through the high windows, illuminating the polished wood, the stern faces of jurors, and the mother who refused to speak. Clara Jensen sat perfectly still, hands folded, her eyes trained on the proceedings. She did not flinch. She could not. Prosecutor William Harrington rose again, a calculated gleam in his eyes. "Let's begin with the timeline, shall we?" he said, pacing slowly. On the night of July 12th, Ms. Jensen left her apartment for work. Surveillance shows her leaving at 7:15 p.m. The neighbors reported an empty apartment shortly after. By the time the authorities arrived at 7:45 a.m. the next morning, the child had been unattended for 12 hours. How does she explain this? Clara's lips remained sealed, but her gaze never wavered. She could feel the tension in the room, the jurors leaning forward, the child's tiny fingers clutching a stuffed rabbit in the gallery. Eleanor Martinez, her lawyer, remained calm, reading every detail with a strategist's precision. "Objection," Eleanor said finally, her voice steady but piercing. "The prosecution is presenting assumptions as fact. We will demonstrate that Ms. Jensen's actions were not negligence, but precaution under extraordinary circumstances." Judge Harold Benson nodded, acknowledging the objection. "Sustained," he said. "Counsel, please stick to verifiable facts." The first witness was called, Mrs. Carmichael, a neighbor. Her testimony was careful, polite, but subtly accusatory. I saw Ms. Jensen leave her apartment that night," she said, her eyes shifting slightly. "The child's door was closed. I assumed she was alone." Sophie's small hand twitched on the rabbit. Clara felt her heart squeeze. Eleanor had prepared for this, of course. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she did not attack. Instead, she built the narrative with precision, slowly shifting the courtroom's perspective. "Mrs. Carmichael," Eleanor began gently, "you said you saw the apartment door closed. Did you see Ms. Jensen ensure her child's safety before leaving?" The witness hesitated, glancing at Harrington, who nodded subtly. "Well, no, I didn't." "Exactly," Eleanor said softly. "You assumed. But assumptions, as we know, can be misleading." The jury shifted. Some faces softened. Some scribbled notes, their curiosity piqued. Next came Detective Harris, the officer who had responded to the call. His demeanor was firm but not cruel. "The child was unharmed when we arrived," he testified. "We conducted interviews, reviewed security footage. Nothing suggested immediate danger once Ms. Jensen left." Harrington's jaw tightened. He tried to paint the scene as reckless, as cold. But the detective's words, carefully delivered, introduced doubt. Eleanor did not need to argue. She let the testimony speak for itself. Then came the most emotional moment. Sophie's schoolteacher, Ms. Langley, a warm woman in her 40s. She had known Sophie since kindergarten. "Sophie is bright, caring, and observant," she said. Her voice wavered slightly. She often spoke about her mother's love, how her mother would go to any lengths to protect her. I never saw a child in danger because of her mother's choices. Quite the opposite. Ms. Jensen, she was extraordinary." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she did not let them fall. She glanced at Sophie, whose face reflected admiration, relief, and a fragile hope. Eleanor's subtle nod reassured her. This was the story being heard now, the story the prosecution had tried to bury. Harrington was not deterred. He rose again, relentless, methodical. "Ms. Langley, you did not witness the night in question. You cannot verify Ms. Jensen's actions. Isn't it true that her choices were risky?" "Yes," Eleanor interjected. "And yet, Sophie is alive, unharmed, thriving. Doesn't that indicate that the choices, though unconventional, were effective?" The courtroom murmured. Even Judge Benson leaned forward slightly intrigued. Next came the critical piece, the mysterious neighbor who had misunderstood Clara's instructions. She was hesitant at first, fidgeting in the witness box. I thought Sophie was left alone," she said softly. "I didn't realize Ms. Jensen had coordinated care for her with other neighbors. I see now that I misinterpreted her instructions." The jurors exchanged glances. The story was shifting. The mother who had been painted as negligent was now being revealed as careful, strategic, and deeply loving. But the prosecution's strongest card remained. Harrington had obtained CCTV footage from the city's streets. He played the grainy video on a large monitor. Clara's heart sank, but she knew this was part of Eleanor's plan. The footage showed Clara leaving the apartment at 7:15 p.m., exactly as Harrington said, walking briskly toward the hospital. But then, after a few blocks, she ducked into an alley, emerging minutes later with a small backpack. Inside it were the essentials: snacks, water, a first aid kit. She had prepared to check on Sophie while technically still being at work, a nuance the raw footage did not convey. Eleanor took the stand with poise, narrating the sequence. Ms. Jensen had a plan to ensure her daughter's safety while fulfilling her professional responsibilities. The footage alone does not tell the full story, as it cannot show the precautionary measures she took in advance. It is clear from her organization, from her coordination with neighbors, and from her unwavering commitment that her actions were not negligent. The courtroom was quiet. Harrington's frustration was visible, though he tried to maintain control. Then came the emotional testimony that would begin to turn the trial: Sophie herself. The little girl was hesitant, her small voice trembling, but determined. She looked at the jury, then at her mother. "Mommy, she always keeps me safe," Sophie said softly. "Even when I'm scared, she's there. Sometimes I don't know why she does things, but I know she loves me." The room was still. Every adult felt the weight of those words. Clara's silent tears finally fell, streaming down her cheeks. Eleanor offered a tissue, and Clara dabbed them away, holding herself together as best she could. Harrington attempted one last push, asking questions that tried to paint Clara as irresponsible. "Sophie, didn't you feel scared when your mother left?" Sophie shook her head. "No, because I knew she was thinking about me. She never lets anything happen to me." It was a quiet, powerful moment. The jurors whispered among themselves. Even the judge seemed moved, though his expression remained professionally neutral. The day's testimony concluded with Eleanor's closing remarks for the morning session. Ms. Jensen's silence is not a mark of guilt. It is a mark of protection. Love does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers. And sometimes it must remain silent to save those we hold dear. As the court recessed for lunch, Clara sat, exhausted but resolute. She had survived the morning. The trial was far from over, but the emotional tide had shifted. The jury now saw her not as a neglectful mother, but as a woman who had carried the weight of the world to protect her child. The afternoon promised further twists: the introduction of new evidence, the testimonies of those who had witnessed the danger Clara had prevented, and the subtle unraveling of the prosecution's narrative. But for now, Clara allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She looked at Sophie, who clutched her rabbit with a tentative smile, and felt a surge of relief. The courtroom drama had begun to tip in her favor. And in that moment, the silent mother felt the smallest flicker of hope. She would survive this trial. She would protect Sophie. And one day, the world would understand why she had remained silent all along. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the courtroom. The air felt electric, every seat tense with anticipation. Clara sat at the defendant's table, silent as always, yet her heart hammered with cautious hope. Today, the truth, the full truth, would finally have its moment. Eleanor Martinez, her lawyer, stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the defense has obtained new evidence that directly addresses the circumstances of July 12th, shedding light on Ms. Jensen's actions and her unwavering commitment to her daughter's safety." Judge Benson leaned forward, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Let's see it, Ms. Martinez." Eleanor gestured toward the courtroom clerk, who wheeled in a large monitor. "What you are about to see is surveillance footage, corroborating statements from witnesses, and a timeline constructed from Ms. Jensen's phone records. It shows, beyond doubt, the precautions she took to ensure her child's safety. The first piece of evidence was footage from security cameras on the neighboring streets. The jurors watched, mouths slightly open. Clara left her apartment that evening, but the video captured her entering a local store, purchasing supplies for Sophie, a backpack, water, snacks, a small first aid kit. Every move was deliberate, every step calculated. She was not neglectful, she was meticulous. Next, Eleanor presented statements from neighbors who had coordinated care for Sophie. One by one, they confirmed that Clara had made arrangements with trusted adults to watch over Sophie while she worked. Miss Jensen ensured my schedule aligned with her daughter's needs, one neighbor testified. She checked in multiple times, made sure Sophie was comfortable, and even left instructions in case of emergencies. She thought of everything. Harrington's sharp composure began to falter, though he masked it with clipped words. "These are anecdotes," he insisted. "They do not replace actual presence. How do we know these witnesses are reliable?" Eleanor's response was calm, precise, and devastating. Reliability is confirmed by consistency, timestamps, and corroboration. Every action Ms. Jensen took was documented. Every step she took was designed to prevent harm. The facts are irrefutable. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. Some jurors nodded, whispering to one another. Some scribbled notes frantically. The narrative had shifted dramatically. Then came the most crucial moment, the testimony of Detective Harris, who had investigated the case from the beginning. He stepped into the box, a solemn expression on his face. "I have reviewed additional evidence submitted by the defense," he said, his voice steady. "After re-examining all data, including phone records, neighbor statements, and security footage, it is clear that Ms. Jensen acted responsibly and with extraordinary care to protect her child. The initial report of negligence was based on misunderstanding and incomplete information." The courtroom gasped. Harrington's shoulders tensed. Even Judge Benson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as he absorbed the weight of the evidence. Eleanor smiled softly and turned to the jury. "Ms. Jensen's silence has been misconstrued as indifference. But the truth is, she remained quiet to protect her daughter from public scrutiny and potential danger. She bore the burden of secrecy to shield the child she loves more than anything." The last piece of evidence was the most emotional, a note from Sophie herself, written weeks before the trial. Eleanor read it aloud, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "Mommy always keeps me safe. Even when I don't understand, she is thinking of me. I love her so much." A collective sigh swept the courtroom. Even hardened officers blinked back moisture, and several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Clara's hands shook slightly as tears streamed down her face. For the first time in months, she felt the crushing weight of judgment begin to lift. And then, the moment arrived. Eleanor turned to Clara. "If you wish, you may speak, Miss Jensen." Clara inhaled, her gaze falling on Sophie first, then sweeping the courtroom. Her voice was soft but steady, trembling only with raw emotion. "I stayed silent," Clara began, "not because I didn't care, not because I was neglectful. I stayed silent because I had to protect my daughter. Every decision I made, every step I took, was for Sophie. I could not risk her safety, her happiness, or her future by revealing things the world would not understand. My silence was love." The room was still. Even Harrington, for the first time, did not speak. Clara's words, simple and heartfelt, cut through the tension like sunlight-piercing clouds. Judge Benson cleared his throat, his voice solemn. "Ms. Jensen, the court acknowledges the evidence presented and the testimony of your witnesses. It is now clear that your actions were taken out of necessity and care, not neglect." Eleanor's eyes met Clara's, and in that moment, no words were needed. Justice, long delayed, was finally within reach. The jury deliberated for only a few hours, though those hours felt like an eternity to Clara. She remained seated beside Eleanor, holding Sophie's hand tightly, whispering reassurance to herself as much as to the child. Finally, the courtroom was called to order. Judge Benson stood, his gavel raised. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, rose. "We have, Your Honor. We find the defendant not guilty." The words struck Clara like a thunderclap. Relief, joy, and disbelief collided within her. Tears flowed freely as she embraced Sophie, holding the child close as if to make up for every second they had endured apart. The courtroom erupted soft murmurs of surprise, applause, and whispers of admiration. The mother who had been silent for months, judged unfairly, had finally been vindicated. Her love, patience, and courage had carried them both through the darkest hours. Outside the courtroom, sunlight bathed the city streets. Clara held Sophie's hand, looking down at her daughter's smiling face. The storm had passed, and for the first time in months, they were free. Clara whispered, her voice catching with emotion, "We're safe now, Sophie." "We're safe, and we're together." Sophie hugged her tightly, the stuffed rabbit clutched in her other hand. "I knew you would protect me, Mommy," she said simply. And in that moment, the world seemed right again. Justice had been served, not through spectacle or drama, but through truth, courage, and a mother's unwavering love. Clara Jensen, the silent mother, had finally spoken. And the world had listened. The courtroom had emptied, leaving only the echoes of what had transpired that day. Clara Jensen sat on the steps outside, the sunlight warming her face as though the city itself were celebrating her victory. Sophie's small hand rested in hers, fingers entwined tightly as if afraid the moment could disappear. But it would not. For the first time in months, Clara felt truly free. The weight of suspicion, the relentless whispers, the crushing judgment, all of it had been lifted. The trial had ended, the truth revealed, and justice had prevailed. She looked at Sophie, the girl who had been her anchor, her reason to endure, and felt a swell of pride and relief that words could scarcely capture. "Mommy," Sophie said softly, glancing up with those wide, trusting eyes, "are we really okay now?" Clara hugged her tightly. "Yes, sweetheart. We're okay. More than okay. We're safe, and we're together. Always." The weeks following the trial were quiet, almost painfully normal, but Clara cherished the simplicity. There were no flashing cameras, no judgmental stares, just the everyday rhythm of life she had longed for. They returned to their apartment, but now it felt different. Not a place shadowed by fear, but a home filled with light, laughter, and the warmth of safety. Clara returned to her work at the hospital, though with a lighter heart. Every patient she treated, every life she touched, reminded her that courage and care could coexist. She was no longer a mother under scrutiny, but a mother validated, her love recognized in the most undeniable way. Sophie thrived as well. School no longer carried the tension of whispered rumors, and she found joy in simple pleasures, drawing, playing in the park, sharing stories with friends. And every night, when Clara tucked her into bed, the child would whisper, "I love you, Mommy. You're my hero," and Clara's heart would swell with the quiet, fierce pride that had carried her through months of fear and uncertainty. Even the city seemed kinder. People smiled at them as they walked down familiar streets. Neighbors greeted them warmly, no longer skeptical, but respectful of the mother who had acted with thought, bravery, and an unwavering dedication to her child. Clara often reflected on the trial, the moments of tension, the emotional testimonies, the fear that had clawed at her chest. She realized that her silence had not been a weakness, but a shield, and that in choosing to endure judgment, she had preserved what mattered most, her daughter's safety and peace of mind. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting golden hues across the apartment, Clara and Sophie sat by the window, watching the city bustle below. Sophie held her stuffed rabbit in one hand and her mother's hand in the other. "Mommy," Sophie said, tilting her head, "do you think anyone will ever understand why you stayed silent?" Clara smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Sophie's face. "Some may never understand, sweetheart. But that's okay. What matters is that we do. And one day, maybe others will see too, and know that love sometimes speaks in silence." Sophie snuggled closer. "I already know, Mommy. I always knew." The two of them sat there in silence for a while, not the tense, fearful silence of the past, but a peaceful one, a silence filled with love, understanding, and the unspoken promise that they would always protect each other. Life returned to its small, ordinary joys. Clara and Sophie planted flowers on their balcony, laughing as petals fell to the sidewalk below. They baked cookies on weekends, sharing warm smiles and sticky hands. And though the city outside continued its endless rush, inside their apartment, the world felt safe, familiar, and filled with love. The experience of the trial had changed Clara forever, but it had also strengthened her bond with Sophie. They had endured fear, scrutiny, and uncertainty, but the trials had only made their connection stronger. Each hug, each shared laugh, each quiet moment of trust was a testament to the resilience of love. One crisp morning, Clara walked Sophie to school, the girl skipping ahead with a backpack bouncing on her shoulders. Clara watched, a tender smile on her face, knowing that every sacrifice, every moment of silence, had led to this, the freedom to live, to love, and to laugh without fear. As they waved goodbye and Sophie bounded toward her classroom, Clara felt the sun on her face, warm and reassuring. She whispered softly to herself, "We made it, Sophie. We made it together." And in that quiet, golden moment, Clara Jensen, the mother who had endured judgment in silence, who had borne the weight of fear, suspicion, and uncertainty, finally felt peace. She had faced the storm and emerged victorious, not through compromise, but through courage, love, and unwavering devotion. The city continued its relentless pace around them, but Clara and Sophie moved through it hand in hand, free at last. And for the first time in a long while, the silent mother had no need for words. Her life, her love, and her daughter's safety spoke louder than anything the world could say. In the heart of the modern city, a mother and daughter had found their sanctuary. They had survived, they had triumphed, and they had each other. And that, Clara knew, was more than enough. Would you have stayed silent like Clara to protect someone you love? Comment below, I want to hear your thoughts. And hit that subscribe button for more real, emotional stories like this.